If you are watching this right now, then you are about to step into a story that will challenge everything you think you know about courage and survival. So before we begin, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments what you would do if you were left to guard the most precious lives on an alien world while the deadliest predators in the galaxy closed in, because this is exactly what happened to one man, and trust me, you are going to want to hear every second of it. The jungle breathed in slow, heavy gusts, its towering vines swaying under the amber light of two moons. 1,000 eyes glittered in the dark, their shapes shifting just beyond clear sight. The alien nursery was a circle of polished stone walls carved with runes older than memory. At its center, 8 cubs dozed in a nest of woven moss, each one barely the size of a human child, but sheathed in iridescent fur and born with tiny curved claws that would one day split bone without effort. Around them stood 3 insectoid warriors of the Vaskra, tall, narrow-shouldered, and plated in bronze armor. They held curved halberds and stood perfectly still, the kind of stillness that comes from knowing you are the only line between life and extinction. The change in guard came with little fanfare. A tall figure in mismatched armor stepping from the mist, his boots sank slightly into the moss, his helmet under one arm, his eyes scanning every shadow. Captain Jack Hale was human, a fact that made the Vaskra warriors twitch with something close to irritation. The humans were allies, yes, but fragile ones, soft-skinned, too slow, too easily broken. No one said this aloud, yet their mandibles clicked with a rhythm that spoke volumes. High Claw Sareth arrived moments later, her presence part command, part judgment. Her segmented body gleamed under moonlight, and her voice when it came was a low vibration that carried an edge. "I do not understand this decision," she said to the air, though her unblinking eyes were fixed on Jack. "He has no claws, no chitin, no venom, and yet the council places the future of my blood under his care." Jack let the words pass over him without flinching. He'd heard worse from superior officers on Earth. He simply knelt to the cubs, checking the boundaries, noting where the moss was disturbed, where prints not made by Vaskra feet pressed into the damp soil. "I do not need claws," he replied softly, not to boast but as a plain statement of fact. His gaze traced a broken section of the outer wall just wide enough for something fast to slip through. The Vaskra sentinels did not see it, but Jack marked it in memory. The first hours were uneasy. The other guardians kept their distance, their compound eyes flicking toward him only when duty required. The jungle around them sang with chirps and trills and the low warbling hum of nocturnal flyers. Every so often a deeper sound rolled through the distance like a drum struck far below the ground. The Narikvesh were out there. They had been for weeks the apex predators of this world, 6-limbed giants with razored jaws and patience enough to watch a prey line for days before striking. The Vaskra claimed their warriors had kept them at bay for generations, but the patterns Jack studied on the patrol reports told him something else. He took his post on the low rise overlooking the pen, a battered rifle across his knees. Though its charge pack was older than some of the cubs he'd seen on Earth, the cubs themselves stirred occasionally, their wide luminous eyes opening to watch him, then closing again as they burrowed into each other for warmth. There was a vulnerability here that did not match the proud violence of their species, and he felt the weight of it settle on his shoulders, heavier than any armor. When a rustle came from the north perimeter, one of the Vaskra sentries clicked dismissively, "Just wind," but Jack rose slowly, keeping his movements smooth. He walked to the edge of the light, his boots whispering against the moss beyond the wall. The jungle loomed deeper than any ocean, and for a long moment he simply listened. The wind here did not move like it did back home. It carried scents rich and damp, and tonight it carried something else, absence. The smaller night creatures had gone silent in a wide circle. That silence traveled like a ripple in water, and he knew then that the predators were closer than they had been all week. Returning to the pen, he adjusted the placement of a few dim perimeter lamps, tilting them to throw longer shadows that would break the line of sight from the treeline. The Vaskra watched in quiet confusion. Their training followed rigid patrol patterns, while his moved like water, bending to whatever the moment demanded. "You trust the forest too much," Jack told one of them. "You forget it will feed you one night and feed on you the next." The warrior made a low chittering noise, half insult, half curiosity. Hours passed, the moon slid lower, the air cooled. Jack kept his watch without shifting from his post, his eyes tracking small movements far in the dark, not always shapes, sometimes just the hint of a presence, the kind that sets instincts screaming, the kind he'd learned to read in war zones long before this planet. At the edge of dawn the cubs stirred again, small voices churring softly. Jack crouched beside them, checking each for injury. He found none, but one of them, a pale-furred runt, pressed its tiny hand against his wrist and held on longer than instinct required. It was warm and trembling. Jack felt the pulse of its heart through his skin, a steady, fragile beat. He looked up to find High Claw Sareth standing over him, her expression unreadable, perhaps measuring him against her private doubts, perhaps seeing for the first time that his focus was not on proving himself to her but on keeping these small lives breathing until the next sunrise. The day shift approached, the sky turning a molten gold through the canopy. The Vaskra warriors who replaced the night watch looked at Jack's unbroken stance and the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes. They did not speak, but one of them inclined his head slightly, a gesture that in their culture was reserved for fellow warriors. It was small, but it was the first crack in the wall of mistrust. Jack left the pen only when the cubs were surrounded again by the tall armored guardians. He moved with quiet precision, his boots making almost no sound as he passed through the outer gates, yet even as the day grew brighter he felt the eyes on him from somewhere deep in the jungle, eyes that did not belong to the Vaskra or to any friendly thing. The council would call this a peaceful night. He knew better. Peace was just the thin breath before the first scream, and whatever had watched from the treeline was not finished, it was only beginning, and Jack intended to be ready when it came. The second night came with a heat that clung to the skin, the air thick enough to slow the breath. The jungle was restless the way a crowd becomes restless when something dangerous moves through it. Unseen, Jack sat in the guard post, cross-legged, rifle across his knees, his eyes not on the trees but on the shifting shadows between them. The cubs slept in their moss cradle, their chests rising and falling in sync as if they shared a single dream. The Vaskra warriors on watch had settled into their routine, walking the perimeter in measured steps, their halberds gleaming under the moons. Jack had learned their rhythm, and he could see where it faltered. Every 20 paces a gap opened in their coverage, just long enough for something fast and clever to exploit it. He said nothing yet. A faint pulse on the motion sensor broke the stillness, the screen lit with scattered red points moving beyond the wall, far more than the handful he had seen the night before. Jack flicked the display brightness low and leaned in. The red points moved not like animals wandering but like units advancing, each closing the gap in unison. He keyed the comm to alert the others, but static rasped in reply, a dampening field, something the Vaskra claimed the predators could not use, but here it was wrapping them in silence. He rose without haste, crossing to the nearest warrior and placing a hand on the chitin plate over her shoulder. "We are about to have company," he said quietly. She tilted her head, mandibles clicking in disbelief, but her compound eyes shifted toward the treeline just as the first shadow detached itself from the dark. The Narikvesh came without warning in a blur of limbs, their bodies low to the ground, their heads a wedge of fangs and reflective eyes. They moved in coordinated arcs, two circling wide to draw attention while three more bounded toward the pen. The Vaskra leapt to intercept, their halberds flashing, but the predators adapted mid-strike, twisting out of reach and driving the warriors back from the cubs. It was a tactic Jack recognized instantly: divide and overwhelm. He moved before the thought finished, pulling a flare from his belt and striking it against the wall. The sudden bloom of light was a savage orange. The predators recoiled just long enough for him to yank a spool of comm wire from his pack, stretching it across the narrow pass between two boulders at knee height. The first Narikvesh hit it at full speed, its front limbs tangling as it crashed into the stone. Jack was on it in a heartbeat, driving the butt of his rifle into its jaw until it stopped moving. The others adapted quickly, their eyes narrowing as they tested the light circle. Jack shifted his position, forcing them to track him instead of the cubs. He could feel the sting of sweat in his eyes, the burn in his shoulder from an old wound, but there was no time to stop. He seized a loose length of jagged pipe from the repair pile and hurled it like a spear into the flank of another predator. The thing screamed a sound like tearing metal before it whirled and fled into the dark. Two more came at once, one low, one high. Jack dropped flat, the high one overshooting him while the low one barreled into his side. The impact drove the air from his lungs, claws raking across his back, but his knife was already in his hand. He plunged it into the base of the predator's neck, feeling the shudder as it went still. The other landed behind him, turning to strike, but a burst from his rifle at close range punched through its skull. The smell of scorched flesh and ozone filled the air. By the time the Vaskra regrouped, three predators lay dead at his feet, his own blood mingling with theirs. The cubs still huddled unharmed in the pen. Sareth arrived then, her armored frame glinting as she strode through the mist, her gaze sweeping over the scene, then locking on him. Her mandibles opened, but no words came. Instead she studied the fallen predators as if seeing them for the first time, each wound deliberate, each kill close and personal. One of the younger warriors approached Jack, hesitating before bowing her head slightly. It was the smallest of gestures, but the weight behind it was heavy. In their culture, a mark of respect earned only in life, risking defense. Jack acknowledged it with a nod, then turned his eyes to the jungle beyond. The air was still thick with the scent of the Narikvesh, but he knew this had not been their full strength. This had been a test, a measure of his resolve and his methods. He could feel it in the way they had withdrawn, not scattered, not panicked, but with a strange unity, as if called away by an unseen hand. Somewhere out there in the dark something had been watching the fight, and now it knew exactly what he was capable of. Sareth broke the silence finally. "You killed three of them without plasma weapons," she said, as though testing the truth of it against what she saw before her. Jack met her gaze without a trace of pride, just necessity. "I did what was needed." Her eyes narrowed, but she did not argue. Instead she turned to the warriors and ordered the perimeter doubled and the cubs moved deeper into the pen until further notice. As the others set about repairs, Jack crouched by the smallest of the cubs. It blinked up at him with those wide luminous eyes, a smear of predator blood still drying on the moss nearby. It reached out a tiny hand, pressing it to his forearm the same way it had the night before, and for a moment the sounds of work and the faint cries of the wounded faded. He understood then why the predators kept testing the walls, why they kept coming, because if they ever broke through, if they ever took even one, the loss would echo far beyond this place. When the sun's first light began filtering through the canopy, he was still at his post, blood dried stiff on his armor, eyes fixed on the treeline, waiting for the next move, because there would be a next move and he intended to meet it head on. The jungle was quieter than it had any right to be the morning after the attack, a stillness that was not peace but the pause between one breath and the next. Jack stood on the outer wall scanning the tree line, his shoulder bound in fresh bandages, the ache a constant reminder of how close the predators had come. The Vaskra warriors moved along the perimeter in tighter formations, now their halberds at the ready, but their eyes slid toward him more often than before, not with suspicion but with something closer to calculation. High Claw Sareth approached without ceremony, her long shadow stretching across the moss, her voice low enough that only he could hear. The council believes the Narikvesh will retreat now that they have suffered losses, she said, but you believe otherwise. I know they will be back, Jack replied. The precision of their attack last night wasn't random, they were testing defenses, mapping weak points. No beast acts like that without reason. Sareth tilted her head as though weighing his words against centuries of instinct in her people, then dismissed him with a flick of her claw, though not before he caught the faintest twitch of uncertainty in her stance. He spent the rest of the day studying the ground where the predators had moved. The prints were deep from their full weight, but there were lighter impressions too, like scouts circling wide, their paths overlapping in a way that suggested coordination. Every few meters the tracks paused as if something had given a signal. He crouched beside one of these spots, brushing away the moss to reveal a gouge in the stone beneath shaped like a deliberate mark. The cubs remained unaware of the growing tension. They played in the pen, chasing each other in clumsy bursts, their fur catching the light, their tiny voices chirping in rising and falling tones. One of them, the pale runt, had taken to following him along the edge of the pen, mimicking his stride. When he stopped, it stopped. When he turned suddenly, it would squeal and dart away, only to return minutes later. It was a small thing, but it lodged itself in the back of his mind that this creature, whose life was so fragile, would try to shadow him without fear. By late afternoon he had mapped the likely approach routes for another assault. They formed a crescent around the north side where the terrain dipped into a shallow ravine. The natural cover there was perfect for an unseen advance, and the current patrol pattern left it open longer than anywhere else. He brought the map to Sareth and pointed to the lines. We need to seal this off with more than warriors, he said. Traps, barriers, fallback positions. If they push hard here, we'll lose the wall. She studied the drawing, but her mandibles clicked with irritation. The council has forbidden escalation, she said, openly preparing for war. Will invite it, then they're already invited, Jack replied. When night fell he ignored the official orders and began his work alone. He dismantled and used comm relays, stripping them for wire and sensors. He dug shallow pits along the ravine, lining them with sharpened shards of stone, and covered them with moss. He repurposed the dim perimeter lamps, setting them at irregular angles so their beams would cast fractured shadows across the approach, making it harder for the predators to judge distance. His hands worked steadily, his ears tuned to every whisper of the forest. One of the younger warriors joined him without a word, carrying a coil of rope and a bundle of jagged stakes. She knelt beside him and began placing them without asking what they were, for her eyes flicked once toward the pen where the cubs slept before returning to her task. He did not thank her, he did not need to. The shared understanding was enough. When the preparations were finished, Jack returned to his post and waited. The moons hung low and fat, the air heavy with the scent of rain. Somewhere far off thunder rolled in slow intervals, but closer than the storm came another sound, faint, almost imperceptible, the distant rhythm of many limbs moving as one. The Narikvesh were massing. He kept his breathing steady, forcing himself not to stare at any one shadow for too long. They were out there watching, deciding when to strike. The Vaskra warriors had doubled their guard, but they still paced in their rigid routes, predictable as a heartbeat. Jack's eyes followed the pale runt cub as it stirred in its nest, peering over the edge of the pen toward the darkness beyond, perhaps sensing the same danger he did. The jungle's chorus began to fade again. The small flyers darted into the canopy, the ground rustlers vanished into their burrows. The predators were close enough now to send that ripple of absence through every living thing. Jack tightened his grip on his rifle, feeling the weight of the moment press in. He knew the next few hours would decide more than just the fate of the cubs. They would decide whether the predators saw this place as a fortress or as a meal waiting to be claimed. Somewhere out there in the dark, a leader among them was watching him, gauging his choices, measuring the resolve in his stance, and Jack intended to make sure that whatever decision it reached, it would remember the cost of coming closer. The first drops of rain began to fall, cool and heavy, the jungle holding its breath before the inevitable storm. Rain sheeted across the wall in silver veils, turning the moss slick underfoot. The jungle smelled of wet stone and sharp greenery. The storm muted all sound except the low, steady thrum of water on armor. Jack stood at the northern rise, his traps set, his rifle-ready eyes narrowing against the blur of the downpour. The pale runt cub peered over the pen wall, its fur plastered to its tiny frame, watching him with an unblinking trust that settled deep in his chest. Through the curtain of rain, movement flickered at the edge of sight, first one, then many shapes slipping between the boles of the massive trees. The Narikvesh were coming in force, their forms bending low to the ground, limbs splayed for speed, their eyes reflecting cold silver in the lightning flashes. Jack's traps would slow them, but he knew the real fight would happen here at the wall, and if they broke through there would be no second chance. The first wave hit fast, two predators leaping the ravine only to plunge into concealed pits, their screeches drowned by the storm. The next wave adapted, vaulting wide but colliding with trip lines that jerked them sideways into sharpened stakes. The rest fanned out, seeking blind angles, their movements too coordinated for chance. Jack dropped the first with a burst from his rifle, the plasma bolts punching clean through its chest, the recoil jolting his already bruised shoulder. A group of warriors rushed to meet the main body of the attackers, halberds slicing arcs through the wet air, but the predators fought with a frightening unity, driving wedges between defenders, forcing them apart. Jack moved to plug one of those gaps, catching a Narikvesh mid-leap and slamming it to the ground with the full weight of his armor. It snapped at his throat. He jammed the muzzle of his sidearm between its jaws and fired the flash, lighting the rain like a strobe. More came circling toward the pen, their attention fixed on the cubs. Jack's breath came harsh, and even as he sprinted across the slick ground, sliding the last few feet into position, he hurled a flare directly into the path of the lead predator. The flare burst into white fire and smoke, the creature veering hard into a barricade with a bone-cracking thud. Lightning flashed, and in that light he saw it, the Alpha towering over the others, its carapace scarred, its jaws wide. In a soundless roar it moved. With deliberate calm through the chaos, its gaze locked not on the cubs but on him. He understood then that every attack, every feint had been building to this moment, a test of will between two hunters. The Alpha advanced, ignoring the Vaskra weapons glancing off its armored hide. Jack stepped forward, rifle hanging at his side, free hand lifting in a small beckoning gesture. "Come on then," he said under his breath, the storm stealing the words but not the intent. The Alpha charged its speed, shocking for its size. Jack waited until the last possible instant, then rolled sideways, letting its momentum carry it into the kill zone. He had marked hours before one of the repurposed lamps flared to life, blinding it for half a second, and in that half second he raised the rifle sighted between its eyes and fired. The bolt punched deep, the Alpha's body jerking once before it crashed to the ground, the impact sending ripples through the water, pooling at their feet. The battlefield froze. The other predators halted mid-motion, their eyes turning toward their fallen leader. The rain drummed on their hides, but none moved closer. Jack stood in the open, rifle still aimed, daring them to test him. Lightning strobed again, and in that brief light he saw recognition in their eyes, not fear but a predator's acknowledgement. They backed away in slow unison, retreating into the black gaps of the forest until only the storm remained. The warriors moved among the fallen, finishing the wounded, their breathing harsh in the rain. Sereth approached, her armor streaked with mud, her gaze sweeping over the scene before settling on him. Her mandibles flexed once, twice, then she reached up, unclasped a crest from her shoulder plate and pressed it into his palm. It was warm from her body and heavier than it looked, a warrior's mark of honor. No words passed between them, none were needed. Jack turned back toward the pen, the cubs pressed together near the wall, the pale runt stretching one small arm toward him. He knelt, ignoring the sting of his reopened wounds, and let its tiny hand grip his finger. Its eyes were wide, luminous in the stormlight. Somewhere in the distant treeline a pair of predator eyes blinked once, then vanished. He knew they would come again someday, and when they did he would be here waiting. The storm began to ease, the first threads of dawn unraveling the darkness, steam rising from the ground as the rain slowed. The Vaskra warriors straightened from their work, and the cubs settled back into the moss. Jack remained where he was, the weight of the crest in his hand, the memory of the Alpha's gaze in his mind. The night had been a victory, but victories here were never permanent, and he was ready for the next fight. The morning after the storm was sharp and clean, the air rinsed of the heavy heat, the jungle glittered with beads of water clinging to every leaf. Jack walked the perimeter slowly, every footstep deliberate. The ground was a mosaic of trampled moss and deep gouges where claws had dug in. The predators had been driven back, but the scent of their passing still lingered, faint and acrid beneath the freshness of rain. The Vaskra warriors moved with a new precision, their patrols tighter, their eyes sharper. The memory of the Alpha's death had burned itself into them as much as into him. The cubs were restless, their play loud in the pen, as if some instinct told them the danger had passed for now. The pale runt stayed near the wall, watching Jack with the same unblinking gaze it had given him since the first night. He felt the weight of that trust more keenly now. The storm had been a battle, but it had not been the war, and somewhere in the shadows beyond the wall the predators were adapting again. Sereth joined him at the northern rise, her armor polished but scarred from the fight. Her eyes scanned the forest before settling on him. "The council is satisfied with the outcome," she said, "but there are whispers the predators will not forget what happened." "They never do," Jack replied, his voice steady. "If they come back they'll come smarter and harder." Her mandibles clicked once in agreement. "We have reinforced the wall, tripled the patrols," but she paused as if measuring the value of the words against her own doubts, then added, "The cubs are safer because of you." He did not answer at once, his gaze fixed on a faint disturbance in the undergrowth 50 meters out. The branches shifted without wind, then stilled. His instincts stirred, but no shape revealed itself. The forest was patient, it could wait longer than anyone standing on the wall. The day passed in uneasy quiet, the jungle alive with the sounds of returning creatures, but always beneath that life was the hum of watchfulness. As evening came, a low mist crept in, curling around the stones. The warriors kept to their patrols, but Jack remained at his post. The mist muted shapes and sounds, and in that dimness he caught sight of movement, low and purposeful. At first he thought it another scout, but then more shapes followed, weaving in and out of the fog until he could count at least a dozen, all keeping their distance. He knew this was not an attack, it was a test, a reminder that the predators had not retreated far. They were learning his patterns now, just as he had learned theirs. One stepped forward into the open, not the alpha but large, its carapace unmarked, its head tilting in a slow deliberate motion. Its gaze found him and held. It was not a challenge, not yet, but a statement: we are still here. Jack felt the old edge of combat focus return, the narrowness of the world to one opponent, one decision. He raised his rifle but did not aim to fire. Instead he stepped down from the wall, closing the distance by 3 paces before stopping, his boots sinking slightly into the damp moss. The predator did not move away, it simply regarded him, the mist wrapping them in a private arena before it turned and vanished into the trees, the others melting away with it. He stood there a long moment, the forest closing in again with its usual sounds. When he returned to the wall, Sareth was watching him, her eyes unreadable. "They are not done," she said quietly. "They will never be done," Jack replied. The cubs settled for the night, their small forms curled together, the pale runt last to close its eyes. Jack watched over them until the moons rose high and the mist burned away in silver light. He knew the predators would come again, perhaps tomorrow, perhaps months from now, but when they did they would find the same humans standing at the wall, waiting, willing to meet them on any ground they chose. In the quiet hours before dawn he touched the crest Sareth had given him, the metal warm against his palm. It was not a token of victory but a promise, a reminder that his place here was not by accident. The jungle might belong to the predators by birthright, but the wall and everything within it belonged to him so long as he drew breath, and when the time came to defend it again there would be no hesitation, only the same calm readiness that had carried him through every fight, because this was not just survival anymore, it was his war and he intended to win it every time they dared to try. The dawn broke pale and thin, the kind of light that seemed hesitant to touch the jungle. Jack had slept little, his mind pacing the same ground as his boots had the night before. The predators' return was inevitable, but it was the manner of their return that gnawed at him. They had watched him from the mist, they had measured him, and predators that measured did not act without a plan. The cubs were quiet this morning, eating in small mouthfuls, their usual chatter subdued as if they too sensed the shift in the air. Sareth found him already on the wall, her approach soundless. "As always, the council has approved limited use of heavier weapons," she said, but her tone was not relief, it was caution. "They fear what escalation might draw, but they fear losing the cubs more." Jack nodded, not looking away from the trailing. Heavier weapons would help, but they would not win the war. The predators had adapted to plasma fire before they would adapt again. By mid-morning the jungle began to change, the sounds of its smaller inhabitants faded, replaced by a slow rolling quiet broken only by the occasional snap of a branch far off. Jack called for the outer patrols to pull in tighter. The warriors obeyed without question, now their respect for him carved in blood and survival. The cubs were moved to the deepest part of the pen, layers of stone and armored bodies between them and the forest. The first sign came as a ripple in the undergrowth on the north and east flanks, simultaneously too far apart to be the same group. The predators were spreading their attack over a wider front, forcing defenders to divide. Jack ran the wall, scanning the lines. A low growl carried through the air, then was swallowed by the wind. The memory of the Alpha's charge pressed into his mind, but he forced it aside. This was not the same fight, this was something larger. When they came it was with a speed and precision that made the last attack seem crude. Smaller predators darted ahead, drawing fire and baiting the Vaskra into breaking formation. Larger ones followed in crushing waves, slamming into the barricades until the stone groaned. Jack's traps maimed and slowed but did not stop them. He moved from one weak point to the next, firing short controlled bursts, driving back anything that breached too far. A scream cut through the storm of noise. One of the warriors pulled from the wall by a predator that had scaled it from below. Jack was there in seconds, leaping down to land on the predator's back, his knife punching between the plates of its neck, hot blood steaming in the cool air. The creature spasmed and collapsed, but already 2 more were circling. He dragged the warrior clear, shoving her toward the wall before turning to face them. The fight became a blur of motion and instinct, the sharp crack of plasma fire, the wet impact of steel on flesh. The predators pressed harder and harder as if they knew the cubs lay just beyond the next breach. Jack felt his muscles burn, his breath rasp in his throat, but he did not slow, he could not slow. Then he saw it, a massive shadow moving through the chaos, not the Alpha he had killed but another, as large, its armor darker, its eyes a molten gold. It moved with deliberate slowness, ignoring the smaller predators as it came straight for him. Jack stepped into its path, rifle raised, but the creature veered at the last instant, driving its weight into the wall. The stone shuddered and split a section, collapsing inward. He was through the gap before the dust settled his body, the only barrier between the breach and the cubs. The gold-eyed predator stepped into the opening, its gaze locking with his. It lowered its head and charged. Jack waited until the last possible step, then sidestepped, letting it carry itself into the narrow kill channel between 2 barricades where its size worked against it. He fired point blank into the softer plates at its side, the first shot staggering it, the second dropping it in a heap at his feet. The remaining predators hesitated, their momentum broken, the gold-eyed ones fall rippling through their lines. Jack took a single step forward, rifle steady, his eyes never leaving theirs. The message was the same as it had been with the Alpha. There was a cost to coming here and it would always be paid in blood. Slowly they began to pull back, dragging their wounded, vanishing into the dark green of the forest until the only sound was the heavy breathing of the warriors and the quiet cries of the cubs. Jack lowered his weapon at last, his arms trembling with exhaustion but his stance still unbroken. Sereth came to stand beside him, her gaze sweeping over the ruin of the wall and the bodies of the fallen, both Predator and Vaskra. "You hold the line," she said, "not as praise but as a truth." Jack looked to the cubs, the pale runt pressed to the front of the pen, its eyes on him, wide and steady. He felt the weight of its gaze like a promise he would keep. For as long as he stood, the predators would adapt, they would come again, but so would he, and the next time they met it would be with the same certainty, the same resolve that had carried him through this night. The sun edged higher, burning away the last shadows of the battle, steam rising from the blood-soaked ground. Jack stood in the breach of the wall, the crest Sereth had given him glinting faintly on his chest, a silent challenge to the jungle beyond. The fight was not over, but the line had held, and while he breathed it always would. The repairs began before the battlefield was even cleared, stone and steel dragged into place by weary hands and stubborn will. The scent of blood and scorched earth hung heavy over the camp. The cubs were kept deep inside, guarded by the most trusted warriors, but their eyes followed Jack whenever he passed, silent questions hidden in their wide alien gaze. Sereth moved among her soldiers, speaking in low tones, directing the rebuilding, but she kept glancing toward the forest as if expecting the shadows to move again. Jack worked without pause, his arms and back aching from the weight of the stone, his mind still turning over the gold-eyed predator, the way it had singled him out, the precision of its movements. It had not been a mindless assault, it had been a test, and tests always led to greater challenges. He caught himself staring into the trees too often, searching for a flicker of movement, for the gleam of those molten eyes. By the second night the jungle was restless. The usual chorus of insects and distant howls was broken by moments of complete stillness. Those moments stretched longer each time. Jack felt the tension in the air tighten like a bowstring. Warriors whispered of omens and restless spirits. Sereth said nothing, but he noticed she kept her plasma blade close at all times, even in the council tent. The attack came at the deepest part of the night, without the warning growls or scattered movement that had marked earlier battles. A single piercing cry shattered the silence, and then the wall erupted in a dozen places at once. The predators came in coordinated waves, not charging all at once but striking and withdrawing, forcing defenders to run from breach to breach. They were faster now, their armor bearing new scars and fresh plating, their tactics sharper. Jack fought at the center, moving with relentless precision, each shot and strike placed to break momentum rather than kill outright. His traps slowed them, but not enough. The cub's pen was already under assault by the time he reached it. Sereth was there, blade flashing in arcs of light, cutting through two smaller predators that had scaled the barricades, but behind them came something far larger. The gold-eyed predator emerged from the smoke and dust, not alone this time but flanked by two others nearly its size, their movements synchronized like seasoned soldiers. They ignored the outer defenders, focusing entirely on the path to the cubs. Jack stepped into their way, rifle ready, his body tensing for the impact. They did not hesitate. The first lunged high, aiming to clear him entirely. He shifted just enough to drive the butt of his rifle into its throat, sending it tumbling. The second tried to flank, but Sereth intercepted, steel meeting claw in a shower of sparks. The gold-eyed one came straight for Jack. Their clash was sudden and violent, the force of its charge driving him back through splintering wood. His rifle wrenched from his grip, he drew his knife and met its snapping jaws with a braced forearm. The pressure was immense, teeth grinding against the armor plate until metal buckled. He twisted hard, driving the blade deep into the joint beneath its jaw. Hot blood spilled across his chest, but the predator did not falter. It pushed harder, forcing him toward the cubs. The smallest cub cried out a thin, sharp sound, and something in Jack surged. He shifted his weight, using the predator's momentum against it, slamming it into the wall of the pen. The stone cracked under the impact. His knife tore free, leaving a deep wound. The predator staggered but turned back immediately, its golden eyes bright with fury. The fight became a brutal dance, each movement a balance between precision and raw survival. Jack struck to cripple, not kill, buying seconds at a time. Sereth felled the second giant predator with a clean thrust through its spine, but the third was still tearing through defenders, its roars shaking the barricades. The gold-eyed one feinted left, then lunged right, catching Jack across the ribs with a claw. The pain flared hot, but he stayed upright, refusing to yield. In the chaos, a small shadow darted between them. It was the pale cub, its tiny frame shoving itself between Jack and the predator as if it could shield him. Jack's mind froze for an instant, and in that instant the predator hesitated, its eyes shifting from Jack to the cub and back. Something unreadable passed in its gaze, then it lunged again, but slower, less certain. Jack seized the opening, driving forward with all his strength, his blade sinking deep into its chest until the golden light in its eyes dimmed and went out. The remaining predators faltered, their charge broken. They began to withdraw, dragging their wounded into the jungle. The defenders did not pursue, instead they closed ranks around the cubs. Jack stood over the fallen gold-eyed predator, his chest heaving, the pale cub pressed against his leg, trembling but unhurt. Sereth came to his side, her gaze moving from the predator's corpse to the boy who had killed it. You are no longer just a guardian, she said quietly, you are part of their blood now, whether you like it or not. Jack looked down at the cub, its small hand gripping the torn edge of his armor, and for the first time he understood that this fight was no longer about orders or contracts. It was about a promise carved in battle and sealed in the eyes of those he had sworn to protect. The jungle would come again, but so would he, and when it did he would not stand alone.